Mm-hmm. We're live.
Okay, great. Excellent. It's time to start our show again and say hello again and sing a song or two for all of you. Good evening and welcome to our first edition of Cemeteries at Sunset with Judas and Magnolia.
Hey, folks.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for showing up and being a friend. So tonight, like I said, is our first episode. And before we get started, you might notice that we have a little picnic setup situation going on here. We are having a picnic in this cemetery, and some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, that's a little morbid, having a picnic in a cemetery, and by definition, it may in fact be, yes. However, there is a long tradition of folks gathering and breaking bread and spending time together in cemeteries. So I want to talk about that just a little bit before we start our walk around. So I really want to talk about garden cemeteries. Garden cemeteries are something that we tend to associate with the Victorian era. They actually got kicked off in France, right outside of Paris, around the year 1800. This became a fad. It spread throughout Europe, throughout the Americas. We have it here in the United States. And what's really particularly interesting to me about garden cemeteries is that these really served as the first kind of public parks before we had a national public park service and system in this country. So they were these beautiful landscapes that had gorgeous statuary and had, these rolling landscapes, sometimes lakes or ponds that people would fish in. Sometimes people would hunt game in these places. People would gather for games, for picnics, for spending the day together as a family. And so these really were public, open, beautiful spaces, and they led to our public parks. So we don't really utilize these spaces as much in this way now. Another tradition that we can look to for gathering and breaking bread in cemeteries is when cemeteries used to be more of a community space, when they were more run by the community. And so back at the turn of the century, so many cemeteries started out as family plots and then expanded to include more of the community. And so they would have these cemetery work days, also called decoration days. I've also seen the term homecoming days used. And so they would have these days where the community would gather together. Even if they were far-flung, they would come back home and they would take care of the cemetery. They would take care of their ancestors there and clean it up. And then they would have a meal together and they would celebrate. Now, over time, as transportation became more accessible to more people, particularly with our national highway system, our interstate system really expanding, families are becoming more far-flung. People aren't coming back so much during those decoration days, those cemetery work days, to care for these spaces. We start seeing perpetual care put into place. So when you buy a cemetery plot these days, you're not only buying the space, you're purchasing that service of perpetual care for someone else, whether it's a private cemetery that's owned by a company or perhaps a public cemetery owned by the city government, right? You're paying for someone else to do that perpetual care of the space, right? So we see less of those community gatherings like we once did. So we're working on bringing it back. We're starting off with a picnic. I'm sure that you're working on dinner as well. Thank you for joining us. I think now we can start our walk. So let's go.
And remember, folks, if you enjoy what you're seeing today, And if you're learning something about cemeteries, their tradition, and their architecture, we hope that you can find it in your hearts to put a little something in our digital hat. You can find us at judasandmagnolia.me try that again.
So if we're thinking about PayPal, you can find us at paypal.me/judasandmagnolia. Or if you'd like to give on Venmo, you can find us at Judas and Magnolia. And I'm glad that you brought that up because as full-time artists, this is part of what we do. We're constantly creating for you. It's part of who we are. So this is just one of our digital series that we do every week. You can also find us on Fridays with Antique Quarantine, and you can find us on Thursdays with our costumed modeling event. So
remember, folks, we've got a special offer today that if you happen to donate $5 or more to Judas and Magnolia, we will send you a rubbing of the gates ajar symbolism that we'll be going over in today's cemetery study. And if you want something truly special, share this live feed and you'll be entered in for a chance to win a spiritualist pendulum. We'll mail it right out to you if you share this live feed.
So on that note, I want to talk a little bit about The Gates Ajar. So this is a book that I just finished rereading. I actually posted a link to it in the event for tonight. So check it out if you're interested. I highly recommend it. So The Gates Ajar is a book that I first read about in another book that I was reading. I was reading about cemetery symbolism, and it discussed The Gates Ajar, the book, because it was talking about well, first, before I tell you why this book was such a big deal, I want to give you the context of when the book was published, okay? So you have to really understand it in its historical context. So The Gates Ajar was written around 1868, okay? So right after the Civil War. It was written by Elizabeth Phelps, that's Phelps with a PH. And at the time, it was not only sensational, it was borderline heretical, okay? It was scandalous. And when I tell you why, you're gonna think, well, why? That doesn't even make sense. Because it's such a part, these ideas that were discussed in this book were such a part, they're such a part today of just how we think of the afterlife and our loved ones who have gone before us, right? They're so commonplace today. At the time, not so. They were outlandish. So the context of this book, it's written as a diary. The main character's name in the book is Mary. And Mary's brother has gone off to the South to fight in the Civil War. He was killed and he was shipped back home, where he was buried in the family plot. That was pretty normal for those days, to have a family plot on your family land. So Mary, the main character, is beside herself with grief, okay? She's unconsolable. And her aunt comes to visit. And through a series of conversations throughout the book, perhaps about a year or so, Mary begins to find healing and solace. But it's only because of these deeply theological conversations that she has with her aunt. And her aunt is saying things to her like, you shouldn't be sad that your brother is dead because he wouldn't want you to be sad. And truly, you can't miss him because he's here with you now. He's here with you when you see a rainbow in the sky or hear the sound of the raindrops on your windowsill. He's near you always and watching over you. And again, today, that idea does not really sound extraordinary, but at the time, like I said, it was nearly heretical, okay? This was one of the top-selling religious books of its time. It came in number 2 on the bestseller list.
And when was this book written?
It was published in 1868 by Elizabeth Phelps.
And this was after the Civil War?
Just after the Civil War, about 3 years afterwards. So not only was it the content that was extraordinary, it was the time when So we've got a nation that's just gone through the Civil War, and so we're in this moment of both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in that the North won and we've abolished slavery. Good job. We still have more work to do. And tragedy in that the death count, the loss of life from the Civil War is still, to my knowledge, the highest count of any single war that the U.S. has officially engaged in. So it was this time of collective grief and collective trauma, which I think many of us can really, really relate to right now in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of continued fights for social justice, very much very similar to the situation that they were experiencing at this time. So the idea that your loved ones that you've lost are not locked away behind some faraway gate, but rather that these gates of heaven are still open, they're slightly ajar, and they let your loved ones pass from that celestial plane down to the earthly plane and back and forth to be with you. This was incredible. It was groundbreaking.
And this really connects to a wider understanding of spiritualism that took place right after the Civil War.
Oh my gosh, exactly. So this author has 2 other books called the Spiritualist series. And if these books didn't start this trend, it certainly helped to kick it off. And so when we say spiritualist trend, we're talking about a specific religious movement in America post-Civil War. And it really started in America. We did also see it a little bit in Europe, specifically Britain. And for example, Harry Houdini, the great escape artist, he spent so much of his life debunking spiritualists of the time who were using parlor tricks to prey on people's emotions, to prey on them missing their loved ones. Spiritualism is about the belief that we can use certain methods to contact the spirit world and talk with our loved ones. At the time, there were many charlatans, many magicians employing parlor tricks to make this happen. And people like Houdini were working to debunk them. Now, if you know and follow our work, then you've probably seen that we also do a theatrical Victorian seance. And we're using some of the exact same methods that these magicians were using back then. And it might seem silly, but some of these things are so compelling in the moment. We have literally had people break down in tears during these sessions. Even when we are up front, we are magicians and illusionists. We are producing a theatrical Victorian seance that is historically correct, right? And there are not that many, not everyone is as honest as we are in telling you that these things are indeed magic tricks. However, if you are interested in seeing this done, let us know, and we would love to take you through a Victorian seance.
Something I think is of note. We might find it in today's day and age outlandish that people would fall for such tricks. But you've got to remember that the times were changing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There were telegraphs. There was ways to connect with people at far distances. And if that was the case, a lot of people asked themselves, well, if I can chat with my aunt on the other side of the continent, why couldn't I chat with my dead brother? They started to ask questions of that nature. So it became a really novel idea that people could speak to the dead. We take it nowadays as sure that was a belief, but it wasn't a belief people always had. It was really novel to the late 1800s.
Absolutely. So, we talked about the gates ajar, and now coming up, so I was so excited to see just about a month or so ago when we first experienced the cemetery. I was so excited to see several examples of this symbolism, the gates ajar on headstones throughout this cemetery.
And once you folks see it, you'll probably be able to recognize it at a cemetery near you. It's a very popular bit of imagery. We're going to zoom in on it here.
And so we have two headstones here, side by side. You can see there are gates on either side, slightly ajar. And these are really gorgeous marbles. So I don't know if that imagery is going to come through super clear because of that marbling in the background there.
Now, between the gates, there's a star. And sometimes there's a star, sometimes there's not, and other times there's a crown in place of the star. That star just symbolizes heaven. If it's a crown, it may symbolize God. And if there's nothing, it just symbolizes the afterlife. So you can see again how the gates are slightly ajar so the spirits may pass back and forth between them and visit the living. Gonna have a look at this other headstone right here. Oh, thank you for letting us know that, Barry. Magnolia, if you would speak up some for us.
Oh, great, thank you. So I mentioned that there were several of these examples of the gates ajar. We literally, all we have to do is turn around, and right here we have two more examples. Now, another piece that I want to point out here is that if their heads are placed towards the headstone and their feet are down here towards us, then the placement of these two, this husband and wife, is such that she is on his left side. Okay, and that is a very traditional placement that we see in older cemeteries with older graves like this. Now, I point this out because I personally find it fascinating. What's happening here is that we see this because of Christian storytelling. In Bible stories, we see that the story is that when Eve was created, she was created out of the left side of man. And you see that not only in wedding ceremonies, we supposedly see that in the nuptial bed. We're supposed to sleep that way. So who knew, darling? We've been doing it right this whole time.
Hey, go us.
And then we even see that in death. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it highlights for us in particular as storytellers, but for all of us as participants active participants in culture and society, this really highlights that the stories that we tell and the words that we use are so important. They have meaning, and they mean so much that they really shape the landscape around us in significant ways, even if we may not realize it. All right. So, important reminders to be aware of the stories we tell and the stories we listen to, as well as the language that we use. Now, our next segment, oh, go ahead, dear.
We're about to move on to our next segment.
Yes.
And before we do so, I want to thank everybody who's tuned in. And I want to remind you of our offer for today, that if you share this live stream, you will be added in to a drawing, and the winner will receive a spiritualist pendulum. We'll mail it out to you. And anybody who donates $5 or more to the Judas and Magnolia through PayPal or Vimeo will receive a rubbing of the gates ajar symbolism off of one of the headstones we saw in this video today.
And to be clear, that's the Venmo platform, not the Vimeo
Oh,
platform,
thank you.
which is for sharing videos. Yeah, but rather Venmo. So, okay, so fair warning, before we move on, this next part of our segment is a little sensitive. So I want you to be aware. This next part, I really felt like I had to include for family and personal reasons. If you can't watch this, I do hope that you will tune in for next week's edition. We're going to be discussing sort of secret societies and fraternal organizations. So I hope you can tune in for that.
And that's in next week's episode.
That's going to be next week. But for now, we're going to be looking at notable features of children's graves. Let's go. Now, I said that I felt like I had to include this bit in our episode today for family reasons and for personal reasons. So what I mean by that, also, when you know the symbolism that you're looking at in these spaces, you cannot not see it, okay? Walking through this space, it is so obvious that there are so many children here, and it is incredible. It is heartbreaking. So, what we're looking for when we're looking at children's graves, you're going to see lambs, okay? And that very much pulls back into that Christian story, the story of the Good Shepherd. It's, I think, comforting for parents if your little one cannot be with you, then who better to take care of them than your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, right? There's a song, come and follow me, I will bring you home, I love you and you are mine. So that Christian story of the Good Shepherd, we often see lambs on children's graves. Now we also will see, I think there's one nearby, I'm not spotting it. You'll often also see stumps. So tree stumps, something that's been cut down before its time. And that's an example particularly of when there's been an accident, okay? So this relates to my family story in that I actually carry the name of one of my great aunts. So my granny's, one of my granny's sisters, they grew up in a community much like this, rural Texas. The families are largely agrarian, so mostly farmers. And the kids were out playing on the farm one day, and she was kicked in the head by a horse, an accident, and she was killed. She was 4 years old. And there's a lot of young children out here that you're going to see those little stumps, you're going to see lambs. Another example, and we'll see this up close today, you're also going to see buds, flowers, but they haven't really fully reached their entire bloom. They're just about to bloom, but they've been cut, their life has also been cut short. On the other end of that spectrum, for a life long lived and well lived, you would see a big bushel of hay or wheat, and that signifies something growing its whole entire season, being harvested at the end of the season. Again, a good long life, all right? But on the other end of that spectrum, we see flower buds, we see little stumps, and what we're about to see coming up are in fact called cradle graves. Now, cradle graves you see specifically for infants, and again, tying into my personal story, we know that infant mortality was much higher back then than it is now. Part of my personal story is that when I was an infant, before I was old enough to get those routine shots and vaccinations, I actually contracted whooping cough. And it was only because of the dedication and just incredible care of our family doctor, who picked up his home phone, his landline home phone, at 1 in the morning when my mother called because I had a 104, 105 fever. I was turning purple because of lack of oxygen. He coached her through the methods that literally saved my life. And it's because of that, that especially in the time of a global pandemic, we remember how grateful we are to healthcare workers, to medical professionals, to scientists working to create vaccines for the entire global community. And we know that we must listen to medical professionals, healthcare workers, and scientists, because it's literally a matter of life and death. And with that, we're going to look at a few cradle graves. So actually, I would like to look at this one right here. So there are multiple examples here that you can see in the frame. So we have this one, which is Little Clyde. So cradle graves are generally going to be an oblong shape, like a cradle. The other telltale sign that it's a child is that it is shorter than a full-grown adult human. And especially in these older graves, you see little Clyde, little Sadie is over here. We have one that just says our baby. We have one that just says infant, right? So they literally were not even named, some of them. And this one, this is hard to make out. So I wrote it down ahead of time. This is, here rests the sweetest bud of hope, that ere to human wish was given. If thou wouldst know its present state, repent and seek the flower in heaven. Transfer it right here. So infant mortality today and life expectancy today not being what it used to be. Our hats off to medical professionals and scientists and healthcare workers around the world working to keep us safe. And with that, a reminder that next week, I hope you tune in, we'll be talking about secret societies / fraternal organizations. Of course, we'll be talking about the Masons, and at the very least, we'll be discussing the Order of the Eastern Star and the Woodsmen of the World. If we have time, we might go into others.
Folks, thank you again for tuning into this first episode of Cemeteries at Sunset. If you've learned something, if you've enjoyed what you've seen today, we hope that you can put something in our digital tip basket. You can find Judas and Magnolia on PayPal, on
Venmo, at Judas and Magnolia, paypal.me /Judas and Magnolia, and
you can also keep up with what we're doing by looking for Judas and Magnolia on Patreon. Remember, folks, for this first episode, we have a special offer. If you send $5 or more to Judas and Magnolia on any of those platforms, you will receive a rubbing of the Gates Ajar symbolism that we talked about today. Folks, thank you for tuning in.
And before we go, I've got to say it. Memento mori, memento vivere. Remember death, but remember life. Remember, you will die, but let's remember to live our best lives every day until then. And we never say goodbye, we just say, see you down the road.
See you down the road, folks.